We're going to start in about 15 seconds.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. My name is Derek Sloan, Member of Parliament for Hastings, Lennox and Addington. I'm here today on behalf of the End the Lockdowns Caucus. The End the Lockdowns Caucus is a interparliamentarian, interjurisdictional caucus with over 60 elected members from the federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government. We have party leaders as well who have joined together from over 7 provinces to say that the use of the lockdowns as experienced in this country have been disproportionate to protecting us from COVID in relation to the harms that they have caused. And today I have with me 3 other prominent members of this caucus who will present our view on lockdowns from different levels. I will be addressing the federal level. Member Randy Hillier from the provincial legislature in Ontario will be addressing the Ontario response. Maxime Bernier will be addressing what is going on in Quebec, and Pastor Michael Thiessen will be addressing the impact on churches. We will be taking questions after this presentation, and our sole concern, of course, is to protect Canadians from all harms, including COVID, but in such a way that our net outcome is better as opposed to worse. And I believe with the implementation of the lockdowns as we have seen them, we are in fact worse off than if we had done more targeted measures to protect the most vulnerable. To speak about the federal government, I would like to be fair to them and say that COVID-19 caught all of us off guard. No one here should expect perfection from the government, but we should expect the government to learn and respond quickly. And what we have seen from our government is a series of failures, and I will outline them today. The first was a failure to respond to COVID-19 at the beginning. While countries like Taiwan implemented travel measures against COVID-19 on January 1st of 2020, our public health authorities were calling them racist and ineffective for months after this time. Taiwan is only roughly 100 miles off the coast of China, and yet they have had 11 total COVID deaths to date. That is 11 total, not 11 per million, but 11. This early failure to restrict travel, I believe, enabled the virus to gather critical steam here in Canada. The second failure was a failure to protect the elderly. We knew very early on that the virus was impacting disproportionately our elderly, and yet very little was done to keep them safe. It is true that the regulation of nursing homes and healthcare is a provincial matter, and there were failures at that level, but the federal government was not sounding the alarm on this when early data showed that seniors were disproportionately affected. The third failure was a failure to engage in experimental and prophylactic usage of promising drug and vitamin treatments. I will use ivermectin and vitamin D as examples, but there are others. The studies on the correlation between high vitamin D levels and positive outcomes with COVID have been impervious. The Karolinska Institute just published a comprehensive synthesis in the journal Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology on how vitamin D offers a great degree of protection against all respiratory viruses. Note, I'm not saying cure, but we are talking about what can we do statistically to enable our population to get through COVID with better outcomes. Recently, the World Health Organization updated its guide on therapeutics and COVID-19. Under ivermectin, the meta-analysis shows an 81% drop in mortality among those who used ivermectin as opposed to standard care. It also shows a 64% decrease in hospitalization. Nonetheless, the World Health Organization refuses to endorse it because it claims the confidence level is low. It is shocking to me that these global elites would continue to treat this long-used drug as experimental while treating novel vaccines that were only studied by the companies creating them as ironclad. And we are seeing issues with some of these vaccines right now. We should be proactively trying new treatments as every day counts in this fight. I have seen nothing to indicate proactivity on studying or using these promising treatments. If we are going to force even our 2-year-olds to wear masks, then the least we can do is recommend prophylactic vitamin D usage. The fourth failure was a failure of the federal government to give any useful information on COVID-19. Yes, they told us we were all in this together and other series of platitudes. And yes, they gave us case numbers and death counts. However, they did nothing to quell the fear that's so rampant in our society. This virus is far more dangerous for some people than others. We know through Statistics Canada that 95% approximately of fatalities in Canada due to COVID have been the elderly. Children 19 and under have, rounded to the nearest 0.1%, and I got this data this morning, 0.0% chance of dying from COVID. That data is accurate as of April 9th from Government of Canada sources. There have been 7 total deaths of those aged 0 to 19. We have lost far more kids to suicide than this. Every death is a tragedy. But remember, if we're creating more deaths than those we're preventing, that is a greater tragedy. In 2019, 20 kids, 3 times as many, died from the flu and pneumonia. Why are we keeping kids home from school? These facts in and of itself should keep our kids from being scared to death of this virus. The fear and anxiety from this pandemic have increased anxiety and fear significantly. McMaster reports that children in hospital for treatment after a suicide attempt have tripled over a 4-month period. This was the CBC I read the other day. The odds of the young and healthy dying from COVID-19 are exceptionally low. We should not be scaring them to death. The government could very easily, the federal government could very easily have calmed the nation with a serious and dispassionate look at the data. The final failure was turning on an endless monetary spigot that enticed all the provinces to engage in endless blanket lockdowns that quarantined the healthy and the sick alike. There is no need for blanket lockdowns. Targeted measures to help the most vulnerable would have saved tens of thousands of our seniors. The prophylactic use of vitamin D and ivermectin, amongst other drugs, would very likely have saved many lives. Instead, the government paid for and encouraged these lockdowns with no end in sight. This has been a catastrophic failure, and we need to open Canada up slowly but safely with respect for the vulnerable and working feverishly to examine these promising treatments. The government could do it now, but they are lulled into a false sense of security that is bankrupting our country day by day. Even American liberal media is calling out this government's failures, and we're not seeing the same level of criticism here. Lockdowns have costs. We're seeing it in a rapid rise of eating disorders, mental health conditions, addictions, bankruptcies, and more. The federal government has failed to act quickly and wisely with respect to this virus, and continues to make these mistakes over a year into the pandemic. All I'm asking is for the sanity to begin and to start now. Thank you so much. Ready?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Randy Hillier. I'm the member of the Provincial Parliament in Ontario for the riding of Lanark, Frontenac, and Kingston. It's a pleasure to be here with the End the Lockdown Caucus, and I'll share my few remarks about our government's response to COVID. I believe our province and our country is facing the greatest threat that it has ever faced in its existence and in its history. This threat is not external. This threat is not COVID. This threat is a struggle and a conflict for the conscience of Canadians. We have seen all our governments enact measures that are un-Canadian, measures that are unconstitutional, measures that are political, under the pretext of a health crisis. And I say that with all sincerity. We are engaged in tremendous censorship in our society through the mainstream media, through social media, and self-censorship of ourselves in our desire for conformity. We have attacked, and no one will uphold, our freedom of conscience, our freedom of worship, our freedom of mobility, our freedom of speech, our freedom to assemble and to gather peacefully. All of those are under attack in Ontario and many other provinces. Our provinces will not uphold the rule of law. Our federal government will not uphold the rule of law. And we are becoming a lawless society without freedom. That's what has happened since March of 2020. And it's happened because we prevent honest discussion. We preclude honest dissent. People are ridiculed and scorned for speaking of evidence and data that contradicts the public health narrative. I've had many people ask me, what and how can we explain what has happened to us since March of 2020? And many people think that they liken this to a war. We don't sure who we're at war with. Is it public health who prevents treatments? Is it our governments that are there to protect our freedoms? We need to start speaking honestly. We need to stop acting irrationally. We need to be guided by science and data and evidence, not experts who twist and manipulate that data and evidence. But most importantly, what we have lost in 2020, or that we realized that we lost long ago, we have lost a moral compass in this country. We need to regain our moral compass if we are ever to regain Canada. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michael Thiessen. I'm the campaign manager for Liberty Coalition Canada. One of the things that we need to realize in the middle of this crisis is that science is not a moral authority. Most people today are saying to me, follow the science, trust the science to get us through this. The science says this for today. But science in and of itself has no moral ability. Scientific discovery is a wonderful thing that uses observation and theory to innovate in the physical world. But the directional use of science must be guided by another discipline. Science in and of itself is not a moral authority. Scientific innovation can be a helping hand, or it can be a striking fist. For the past 13 months, Canada has egregiously ignored the rule of law. We have become, as Mr. Hillier has just said, a lawless nation that has all but thrown out constitutional law. And even at times, with the entrance of police onto church property and shutting down different businesses and churches, we have thrown out criminal law. And we have been constantly fixated on science. I love science. I have 2 children who have had significant health challenges, and I greatly appreciate our health professionals. But historically in this country, we received our constitutional and criminal code from the long history of the Western world. The 10 Commandments the moral law of God have provided the foundational principles for life, liberty, and justice. The moral law was designed to prevent and restrain evildoers, and at the same time to provoke each person to acknowledge sin, blindness of our own behaviors, and the validity of judgment upon ourselves. God has given us consciences in order to reveal our behaviors. These eternal principles have been applied in and codified for specific situations in Hebraic, Roman, British, and Canadian law. But now we have traded the 10 commandments of eternal principles for 10,000 COVIDian commandments. Even though the Royal Coat of Arms of Canada invokes the dominion of the Lord Jesus Christ over the land when it quotes Psalm 72:8 in Latin, he shall have dominion also from sea to sea and from the river unto the ends of the earth. And the supremacy of God over the dominion of Canada is clearly acknowledged in the preamble of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whereas Canada is founded upon principles and recognizes the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Even though these things are acknowledged, our nation continues to trade wisdom as positivized historically in our law for a panicked secular response. Never before in our lifetime do we feel so trapped, like permanently living on the schoolyard where the bigger and smarter kids are teamed up and telling the rest of the kids to stay on the fringe and dig dirt in the corners. The Liberty Coalition of Canada is a national network of clergymen, elected officials, such as these marvelous men, small business owners, professionals, legal experts, and other concerned citizens aligned together to produce a change in the current situation for the good of all Canadians. We are currently involved with 5 initiatives, all of which are designed to restore the rule of law and the joy of liberty in this nation. I'm humbled and honored that one of these initiatives is the End the Lockdowns Caucus, and I am proud of these brave politicians and others who are not with us, who are standing up against these illegal lockdowns. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde, ça me fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui avec mes collègues qui font partie, tout comme moi, du caucus national non partisan pour mettre fin à ces confinements draconiens et inconstitutionnels et illégaux. Dans une démocratie, comme vous le savez, l'une des principales obligations des politiciens est de protéger nos libertés individuelles et de protéger nos droits. Eh bien, au cours des 13 derniers mois, des restrictions imposées par le premier ministre et les premiers ministres provinciaux ont violé nos droits et nos libertés. Nous vivons avec des confinements et des restrictions qui dictent tous les aspects de notre vie depuis plus d'1 an. C'était censé être une mesure qui allait seulement durer 2 semaines pour aplatir la courbe. Mais jamais, dans l'histoire de l'humanité, un pays n'a confiné toute sa population pour lutter contre un virus. Cette expérience est une ratée, et ça, je ne suis pas le seul à le dire. Nous devons réouvrir notre économie, sachant que le taux de survie pour les Canadiens de moins de 70 ans est de 99,95 % parmi les personnes infectées par le virus. Et les Canadiens de moins de 30 ans sont plus susceptibles de mourir de la grippe saisonnière que de la COVID. Les gouvernements et les médias, oui, les médias, alimentent la peur et l'hystérie du public à propos de la COVID, en faisant taire les opinions contraires et expertises contradictoires. J'espère que je me trompe aujourd'hui et que les opinions de mes collègues vont être entendues par nos citoyens canadiens. L'hystérie COVID doit prendre fin. Le gros bon sens doit prévaloir. M. Trudeau a déclaré que les vaccins n'étaient pas suffisants pour mettre fin aux masques obligatoires et aux restrictions de distanciation sociale. Pour M. Trudeau, cette fausse crise dure longtemps et plus elle dure longtemps, plus il peut dépenser d'argent et plus il peut acheter des votes. Les confinements et les mesures drastiques ont des effets désastreux. Mes collègues en ont parlé. Nous avons des gens qui meurent suite à des opérations annulées, des décès par surdose de drogue, des dépressions, des suicides, des entreprises qui font faillite. Le remède est maintenant pire que la maladie. Les provinces ont pris ces mesures autoritaires encouragées par le fédéral dans son rôle de coordination en santé publique. Le Parti populaire du Canada cessera d'encourager les provinces à imposer des confinements à leurs concitoyens en ne finançant pas les coûts économiques de ces confinements inutiles et dévastateurs. Les politiciens de l'establishment veulent imposer aujourd'hui un passeport vaccinal. Ils veulent nous diviser en deux catégories de citoyens, les personnes vaccinées et les personnes non vaccinées. Les Canadiens vaccinés auront des privilèges par rapport aux non-vaccinés. Les personnes non vaccinées ne pourront pas voyager, pas aller à un match de hockey, à un concert rock. Ils ne pourront pas participer pleinement à la société civile. Je ne veux pas d'une société où l'on doit montrer ses papiers pour participer à la vie en société. Le Parti populaire du Canada est le seul parti politique national qui se bat ouvertement pour mettre fin à ces confinements autoritaires et contre tout able to participate fully in civil society unless they obey to the tyrannical dictates of the establishment. I don't want a show me your papers society. We will never accept it. It's not the Canadian way. The People's Party of Canada is the only national political party fighting openly to end these authoritarian lockdowns and fighting against the imposition of vaccine passports. In the next general election, Canadians will have a clear choice between all the establishment parties, Liberal, Conservative, New Democrat, Green, and the Bloc Québécois, who support and defend these draconian measures, and the PPC, which will always defend our freedoms. I call upon Canadians today who have a fire in their hearts and want to see our country succeed. We must all work together and stand up against these tyrannical actions of the federal and provincial governments. Only through cooperation we can shape up Ottawa and start making Canada strong and free again. Thank you. Nous sommes prêts à répondre à vos questions. We are ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
And we'll now go to questions, starting with questions on the phone, alternating it between the phone line and the room. One question, one follow-up per usual. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions en alternance entre le téléphone et la salle. Comme à l'habitude, une question suivie. Operator, do we have a first question?
We do. And this is from Lena Dib at the press, La Presse Canadienne. Go ahead, ma'am.
Oui, bonjour. Monsieur Bernier, deux petites questions pour vous. D'abord, à qui pensez-vous que vous parlez en ce moment quand vous voyez la situation au Québec et l'appui que reçoit Monsieur Legault pour ce qui est en train de se passer? Et puis, je vous ai entendu sur le passeport vaccinal. Vous êtes contre. Je me demandais si vous aviez aussi une opinion sur le vaccin. Est-ce que vous allez vous faire vacciner ou est-ce que vous ne voulez pas du vaccin?
Bien, au Parti populaire, nous sommes pour la liberté de choix en ce qui concerne les vaccins. Les Canadiens peuvent et doivent se faire vacciner s'ils le veulent et s'ils le souhaitent. En ce qui concerne moi personnellement, j'ai 58 ans, je suis en pleine forme et donc je ne pense pas que j'ai besoin du vaccin. Mais comme j'ai dit lors de la présentation, je suis contre l'imposition de passeports vaccinal aux Canadiens pour voyager ou faire des activités. Ça va créer ça va éliminer l'harmonie dans notre société. Ça va créer une société où il va y avoir deux genres de citoyens, ceux qui ont un vaccin et ceux qui n'en ont pas. Ça va créer de la discrimination. En ce qui concerne la première partie de votre question, c'était à qui je parle. Je pense que je parle à l'ensemble des Québécois et des Canadiens. Monsieur Legault et Monsieur Arruda ont fait il y a quelques jours, une conférence de presse et imposé des masques pour les activités à l'extérieur. Et je pense que c'est une mesure qui n'a pas lieu d'être imposée. Les gens devraient être libres de porter des masques à l'extérieur s'ils le veulent ou pas. Et oui, je crois qu'il y a une minorité actuellement qui est d'accord avec les propos du caucus pour la fin des confinements, mais cette minorité-là grandit sans cesse et on est une minorité parce qu'on a été coupé de l'action, coupé d'être capable de s'adresser aux gens par les médias ou les médias sociaux. Et c'est ce que je dis. Il y a eu une censure qui s'est effectuée et les gens n'ont pas eu l'occasion d'entendre un autre point de vue que le point de vue gouvernemental et le point de vue officiel. Et c'est ce que je déplore. Donc, je fais actuellement une tournée à travers le Canada pour justement sensibiliser les Canadiens sur l'autre point de vue et demander aux Canadiens qu'ils se lèvent debout pour défendre leur liberté parce que ce qui se passe au pays actuellement, c'est inconstitutionnel et on doit se défendre pour préserver notre liberté ici au Canada en 2021. C'est triste à dire, mais c'est la réalité.
Quand vous dites qu'il y a de la censure, je m'excuse, je m'entends un peu en écho. Quand vous dites qu'il y a de la censure dans les médias sociaux, j'aimerais que vous m'expliquiez comment est-ce quelqu'un vous aurait empêché de propager votre discours sur vos comptes de médias sociaux. Je ne vois pas trop. Et puis, quand vous me dites que vous êtes en bonne santé, vous n'avez pas besoin de vaccin, je me demandais qu'est-ce que vous pensez de l'idée que la vaccination, c'est un effort collectif, qu'on se vaccine pas juste pour soi, mais aussi pour éviter de propager une maladie qui pourrait rendre quelqu'un d'autre malade ou même tuer quelqu'un.
Bien, en ce qui concerne les vaccins, comme vous, pas contre les vaccins, j'ai eu plusieurs vaccins, j'ai été ministre des Affaires étrangères, j'ai eu à voyager, j'ai eu des vaccins, mais pour ce qui est du vaccin de la COVID, comme je l'ai dit, je ne pense pas de le prendre et je pense que j'assume mes responsabilités. On va avoir une immunité collective qui s'en vient ici au pays grâce aux gens qui se font vacciner et aussi aux gens qui ont eu la COVID et qui ont développé des anticorps. Donc, ces deux phénomènes ensemble font en sorte qu'on va avoir une façon de pouvoir, le plus rapidement possible, arrêter ces mesures draconiennes et c'est ce que je souhaite. En ce qui concerne la censure, oui, vous avez raison de dire que je n'ai pas été censuré personnellement sur les médias sociaux, mais on regarde juste qu'est-ce qui s'est passé pour le gouverneur de la Floride, par exemple. Il a fait une conférence de presse avec 3 experts médicaux et YouTube a censuré cette conférence de presse-là. On s'aperçoit qu'il y a de la censure sur les médias sociaux et c'est ce qu'il faut contrer.
We'll now take a question from the room. Louis?
Oui, bonjour, M. Bernier. J'aimerais vous entendre. Ce matin, M. O'Toole présente son plan vert, son plan pour le climat, qui comprend notamment un prix sur le carbone qui serait moins élevé que celui de M. Trudeau. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de ce virage-là que prend M. O'Toole et de cette approche-là par rapport à la tarification du carbone? Mr. Sloan, feel free to jump in also about the climate plan of Mr. Trudeau this morning and the fact that it includes a price on carbon, lower than the one for Mr. Trudeau, but I'd like to hear you about it.
Shortly, just to... ouais, OK, juste pour vous dire que je ne suis pas surpris. Je ne suis pas surpris. M. O'Toole avertit les membres du Parti conservateur qu'il prenait un changement draconien en ce qui concerne la lutte au changement climatique. Là, on est à se battre des deux partis nationaux, les vieux partis, qui va être le plus avoir une position pour lutter contre les changements climatiques qui est la plus efficace. Moi, je dis que, comme je le dis, il faut laisser ça aux provinces. Nous, au Parti populaire, nous n'imposerons pas de taxes sur le carbone, pas de nouvelles réglementations et on va laisser les provinces gérer les changements climatiques. Mais on s'aperçoit que M. O'Toole, vêtement, il porte un masque rouge, un masque libéral, et il pense aller chercher plus d'appui dans les grands centres avec cette politique-là. Je dis aux conservateurs déçus de ces politiques-là que la porte est ouverte au Parti populaire.
Thank you for that question. Frankly, even I was surprised, and I've seen a lot come from Mr. O'Toole and this government. If you remember, in the leadership race, he was very definitive. He was accused, in fact, by Peter MacKay and others of clandestinely wanting to bring in a carbon tax. And I believe that's what's happened today. I mean, people can dispute me if they like, but I think that's exactly what's happened. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that. With respect to what should be done, I mean, again, any global, any plan that Canada has to deal with any sort of environmental issue, particularly when it comes to emissions, needs to be global. And if we take our, 1.7% of global emissions and make it 1.3 or 1.2 at great cost to our own economy, and China grows by 10%, it doesn't help anybody. In fact, it means probably we'll be buying more things from China. So I'm against that, but very interesting that happened today. So thank you for that question.
J'aimerais vous entendre sur un aspect plus technique. Je vois que personne ne porte le masque en avant aujourd'hui. Habituellement, la coutume veut que les gens qui ne sont pas au podium portent un masque. Juste m'expliquer, sans jugement, je veux juste savoir qu'est-ce qui explique ce choix-là que vous avez fait ce matin.
Nous sommes dans une bulle actuellement, la bulle du caucus pour mettre fin au confinement. Nous avons eu plusieurs réunions ensemble, ce n'est pas la première. Et on décide de nous que, je l'ai dit tantôt, ces mesures draconiennes-là sont un peu exagérées. Je respecte les gens qui veulent porter un masque et c'est bien parfait. Mais en ce qui concerne une conférence de presse, je ne vois pas les gens ici en conférence de presse à porter des masques lors d'une conférence de presse. Merci.
Et nous allons poursuivre avec les questions au téléphone. We'll now continue with the questions on the phone. Operator, next question.
If you have any questions, pour vous rappeler, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. La prochaine question est de Andrew Lawton de True North. The next question from Andrew Lawton from True North. Go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. One thing that I'm seeing just from ordinary Canadians is that there's a lot of opposition to lockdowns coming from people who are not partisan conservatives or not even particularly political. And we're seeing this across the spectrum. But I noticed that in the End the Lockdowns caucus, it's not just politicians who have been identified with conservatism or with right-of-center movements, but even a smaller subset of that. So I'm wondering why you're not seeing more support for your cause from politicians that disagree with you on other things, but may agree with you on ending lockdowns.
Thank you for that question. A lot of it has to do with party discipline in this country. The majority of people in our federal and provincial parliaments belong to a specific party, and we have we have strict discipline here. There's an understanding, either implicit or explicit, that you toe the party line. And none of the party leaders have decided to, be against the lockdowns or message on these things. And so I think a lot of people that have issues or maybe questions are afraid to color outside of the lines. Overall, I think by leaders and others, it's a failure of courage, a failure of being willing to perhaps stand up and say, "Hey, we made some mistakes. We've learned. We want to move on." But it's a failure of courage. And I think that's what Canada needs right now, is more courage.
Thank you, Andrew. It's Randy Hillier.
Hey, Randy.
I think what Derek gave a good encapsulation there. I'll just maybe flesh that out a tiny bit. The problems that we're facing in our society of the need to conform within society, our political environment is much the same, but in a smaller microcosm of the distortions and the perversions. That's what's happening. And people in elected office, especially at the federal and the provincial level, many of them understand that their path to re-election is only through a registered political party, and they will not jeopardize their path to re-election, even if it means forsaking their children's and their grandchildren's future. They are going along, many of them, knowing that what we're doing is wrong and casts a significant darkness for our future. The same thing happens, although not quite as clearly identified at the municipal level, but we've seen what has happened with members of the End of Lockdown caucus at the municipal level who have joined. Stephen Van Leeuwen was ostracized and attempted to be and faced much scorn for joining the End of Lockdown caucus. He was removed from the position as deputy mayor. We've seen others, Mayor David Blisma from West Lincoln was removed from the COVID Health Committee for joining the End of Lockdown caucus. We see this everywhere. COVID is being used to beat people into submission and into conformity. That anybody knows, if you want to have honest, truthful, public discussion and discourse, you will pay a price. I'm very thankful that the End of Lockdown caucus are strong men and women across this country who know what it is to be Canadian and know that they will, whatever the price that we were asked to pay, that we will pay it because our children and our grandchildren, their future is worth it. Thank you.
Follow up?
Is the goal of your caucus to eliminate all restrictions and allow individuals and businesses make decisions for themselves, or is there a more moderated framework that you'd advocate for? Some form of restrictions, but a lot fewer and a lot more lax than what we're seeing from provinces right now.
Well, thanks again for the question. This End of Lockdown caucus is a caucus of willing participants. There is no mandate and no expectation that there is only one voice for the End of Lockdown caucus. Each individual has their own conscience and will represent different areas and may offer different solutions. And so there isn't a blanket answer to that, Andrew, but I will say from my perspective, that all the lockdown measures must be rescinded in Ontario. There is no justification for any lockdown measures in Ontario. There is no merit to having any business closed. There is no merit to having any church closed. There is no merit for Bill 195, which delegated all the...
Depuis un bout de temps, on est à peu près à une moyenne de 8 décès par jour. Et donc, c'est cette donnée-là qu'on doit regarder. Maintenant, il y a une immunité collective.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. And you're right. the science is clear that adequate vitamin D level and usage is protective, preventative, not an absolute cure, but preventive and protective against basically all respiratory illnesses, including COVID. The only way that Health Canada will change is either through is essentially if the government